We're going to practice how to say Louisville again this morning. Oh, there we go. This is what you get when people love each other and they come together after 2 years of being apart. Lots of chatter, and I just love it. So good morning. Welcome to the opening plenary of our 84th CHHSM annual gathering in Louisville. Did y'all practice that Louisville over the Louisville? It is. You don't even have to move your mouth to say Louisville, do you? When the annual gathering task force discussed a theme for this year's gathering, they wanted one that spoke to the values of CHHSM, but also the current context in which we are living. We have been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic since we left Memphis 2 years ago. Shortly after the beginning of the pandemic, we were made newly aware, probably some of you weren't newly aware, of the depths of systemic racism in our country, with the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor here in Louisville, Kentucky. The task force arrived at Forward Together as the annual gathering theme, which speaks both to our hope that we can emerge from the pandemic and to our commitment to address systemic racism. CHHSM can move forward, relying on the value that we place in our covenant to be together, whatever we face. And so here we are, exploring how we can move forward together. When the task force began to think about speakers, the name kept coming up. One name kept coming up. He was a commentator on a documentary about Howard Thurman, shown at the NOLAO class, and a PBS documentary on the Black church. Michael Irwin, in the current NOLAO class, an alum of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Where's Mike? Is Mike in here today? Thank you. Helped us make a connection to the person whose name kept coming up, the Reverend Dr. Alton B Pollard III. Dr. Pollard serves as Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary's 10th president, a role that he began in 2018. He is a scholar, author, consultant, and speaker on the subject of African American and U.S. religion and culture. Dr. Pollard was previously Dean of the School of Divinity and Professor of Religion and Culture at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Prior to his 11 years at Howard University, Pollard served as a Director of Black Church Studies and Chair of American Religious Cultures at Emory University, and taught at Wake Forest University and St. Olaf College. Pollard is the author of Mysticism and Social Change, The Social Witness of Howard Thurman, 1992, and a new edition of W.E.B. Du Bois' The Negro Church, 2011, as well as the co-author of Helpers for a Healing Community, a pastoral care manual for HIV/AIDS, 2006. He's also a commentator on the recent PBS series on the Black Church. As we begin to explore the theme of our annual gathering, Forward Together, we are thrilled to have Dr. Pollard with us to offer our opening keynote on Howard Thurman, racial justice and the struggles of the current moment. After Dr. Pollard's keynote, we look forward to having time for a discussion with him and then some time for reflection around our tables. Welcome, Dr. Pollard.
Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me all right. Good. I tend to be a bit soft-spoken, and sometimes I have to remind myself to speak up, Michael. So it is good to be here with all of you today. Just so you know, the title of my presentation has changed just a little bit. And while Howard Thurman is still, Abby, very much a part of me and a part of what I have to say, you'll hear, I think, in the message that there are some permutations that I wanted to go in a slightly different direction with. And so you see the title, Racial Justice, Public Health, and Our Current Struggle. Let me say how good it is to be among all of you who are a part of the United Church of Christ. For those of you who may not know, Howard University School of Divinity, Howard University's origins itself are grounded in the Congregationalist Church, coming out of First Congregational Church in now downtown Washington, D.C. And while the relationship has largely disappeared over the course of the century and a half, the relationship with the School of Divinity remained intact, and so I was deeply immersed in work with the UCC, spending time in the central office in Cleveland, preaching in that magnificent chapel, spending a lot of time moving about, particularly the Central Atlantic Conference with one John Deckenbach. Does anybody remember John Deckenbach? A beautiful man who passed away all too abruptly. And so I have fond memories. I also want to note that Jessica, my beloved, and I are proud graduates of Fisk University. And Fisk University is also historically a part of the Congregationalist tradition, now UCC. And so I mention all that because I want to be sure you know I have a little street cred, okay? Okay, so, and now I am in the Presbyterian orbit, having navigated the ELCA with St. Olaf College, the Southern Baptist with Wake Forest, the United Methodist with Emory, and the non-sectarian at Howard, and so it goes, because that's what the world looks like today. And so we are all one. This was the declaration that Howard Merton, who some of us were talking about this morning at breakfast, Howard Merton Michael, who is famously known for his time in this part of the world and in Louisville, having a walk downtown, literally came to an intersection and had the epiphany, perceiving that God is not only no respecter of persons, but that indeed we are all one. So to Chisholm, thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, to Michael Redinger, to, where's George? Where's George? George, George, you migrated to the back, okay. To George Graham for this opportunity to engage this plenary session. And Michael has indicated that he will be retiring in just a matter of days. Blessings in that platinum parachute that you're taking with you. All good things, as Jessica likes to say, in your stellar years, whatever they may bring. To this august body and the Council on Racial and Ethnic Ministries, and to the UCC faithful everywhere, I want to thank you for last year's resolution to declare and respond to racism as a public health crisis. Your principled thought and action encourages us to think together now on things that seem separate and unrelated to so many people. And yet what is true is that we cannot begin to think well or adequately about public health outside of an anti-racist context. For your faithful commitment to health and human services, to the improvement of the human condition and quality of life for all people, and demonstrated solidarity with the movement for freedom, a just and equitable society, the building of new worlds beyond harm and danger, violence and death, for the healing of the nations and care of the earth for all that you do in your work as Chisholm. I am grateful. And so it is that we want to turn in just a moment to a video clip that we will show, but first a bit of background on this clip. To some of you, it will be a familiar video, or at least I hope to some of you, it will be a familiar video. It is from Jay-Z and Kanye West, their 2012 album, Watch the Throne. Now, Kanye West, 2022 version, could very much use some of the assistance that you present in this room today. But this particular video and this particular opening track, called "No Church in the Wild," won a Grammy Award, and I think still speaks volumes to us today. The video was filmed a decade ago in Prague, Czech Republic. The production was influenced by the protests and civil unrest then taking place across the United States. We remember a little thing called Occupy, 2011 when it began, that swept across the country like wildfire. The Occupy movement itself was influenced by earlier Black-led movements for freedom birthed in the cauldron of this country that have inspired an intersectionality of movements across the globe. As the Black struggle for freedom in the United States has expanded from the foundations of Montgomery, Alabama, Greensboro, Albany, and Selma to Ferguson, Louisville, Minneapolis, Brunswick, Georgia, and more today, it is urgent that we make the historic intergenerational connections between liberating challenges to state violence and oppression that symbiotically build toward a common humanity and retreat from cynicism and despair. Today, halfway around the globe, Ukraine reminds us of the absolute necessity for communities of struggle. Now, if we may, play the video clip from Jay-Z and Kanye. What's a mob to a king? What's a king to a God? What's a God to a non-believer who don't believe in anything? I think it speaks volumes to where we are today in our world. Forms of hierarchy, forms of oppression, forms of faith. So much that could be unpacked from this video that we don't have time to address. Perhaps when it's time for some conversation with each other. Last month, on the morning of February 3rd, I received a text from one of my nieces. The text read in part, Minneapolis Police Department murdered another person this morning. MPD murdered Amir Locke. He was sleeping on the couch of the home that MPD was supposed to be searching, but instead barged in. And Amir, a licensed gun owner, allegedly got up out of shock and was murdered in 9 seconds. My niece was beyond heartbroken. Philando Castile, George Floyd, Dante Wright, Amir Locke, all killed in the place she calls home, St. Paul, Minneapolis. All these Black bodies now made casualties of a militarized society. For much of her young life, my niece has been immersed in freedom's fervor. In today's struggle, service, and suffering, it is hard not to be traumatized if you are young by the crashing waves of racism, exhaustion, and rage. I am concerned for her life. She is filled with promise, a young Black woman coming of age in 2022 in Minnesota in the United States of America. Research confirms what we intuitively know. that the most formative experiences in our life usually take place when we are young. I think back to when I was the age of my niece and nephew, to half a century ago, and the constellation of events that left an indelible imprint on my life. The renowned mystic and activist Howard Thurman, in his groundbreaking work, Jesus and the Disinherited, describes a person's lived biography as, quote, the creative synthesis of what a person is in all their parts and how they react to the living process. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota is famous for its many lakes and mosquitoes. Anybody from Minnesota here? Okay, got a few. Minnesota is famous for its, and I'm headed to Minnesota this afternoon. I'm looking forward to that cold weather. Minnesota is famous for its many lakes and mosquitoes, deer hunting and ice fishing, sub-zero temperatures and mountains of snow. It is home to the indigenous Ojibwe and Sioux peoples and to newer immigrant communities like the Hmong and Somalis, Oromo and Tibetans. Minnesota nice is an expression that is now used. It didn't exist when I was growing up, but I've heard about it since, and I've learned now there's Indiana nice and Wisconsin nice and Iowa nice, and I didn't know there was so much nicety in the Midwest of the United States, but I've come to understand Mid-America's nod to civil culture. Back in the day, many black and brown people in my home state would tell you there was no qualitative difference in the frigid treatment we experienced at the hands of most white people and winter itself. Eruptions in Minneapolis and across this nation and world today remind us that liberation is far from at hand. The year was 1968. I was 12 years old and just learning to enjoy the freedom that comes with leaving childhood behind, or at least I thought I was leaving it behind. I was a young adolescent embarking on that educational rite of passage known as junior high school. I don't even know if they still have junior high schools. They do? Still have junior high schools? I know we've got middle schools, seem like everywhere we've lived, Jessica. It was the first day of class, and I was starting to feel my oats, as the saying goes. Blaring from a classmate's transistor radio was a popular song by Marvin Gaye. I heard it through the grapevine. In the cultural parlance of African America, the grapevine is a reference to the informal networks of news and information that have linked black communities dating back to the antebellum period. And so here I was, the only student exuberantly dancing on top of their desk that morning when our new teacher walked into the room. As it turned out, she was not only my homeroom teacher, she was my English teacher too. In the St. Paul of my youth, long-standing restrictive covenants as in contractual agreements entered into by white property owners, real estate developers, and operators to prevent people of color from moving into white communities. Somehow, these contractual agreements had failed to prevent my parents from purchasing our home. My mother and father were from the Mississippi Delta. Like so many others, they left Mississippi in 1955, only short miles away and from the wake of the lynching of Emmett Till. A decade ago, or rather a decade later, we were the only black family in the white Norman Rockwell-like community where my public school was located. My youthful white peers reflected their families, resented and resisted the threat to their way of life that integration in our black family represented. And when I say they resisted, I mean they physically resisted with guns and knives and clubs and bats. I was the only black student who walked to our school. Every day was a deadly trespass. And then buses brought in a few more black children. Mrs. Lois Dobbs was my first and only black teacher until college. The 1950s and 60s represented the height of the 20th century black-led freedom movement in the United States. The pivotal events of civil rights and black consciousness were part of an ongoing legacy of black freedom struggles, challenging and redefining the life of the nation. The courage of young people, from high school to graduate school, the Little Rock Nine, the Wichita Seven, the Greensboro Sit-ins, the Interstate Freedom Riders, James Meredith into integration of the University of Mississippi, John Lewis, Diane Nash, Ruby Doris Smith, Prathia Wynne Hall, Ann Moody, James Bevel, James Lawson, and Bob Moses, just to name a few. These young people pressed for a more militant activist posture. In Birmingham, Alabama, elementary school-aged children faced rubber batons, police dogs, and high-power hoses. They withstood the bombing of churches, the hostility of white citizens' councils, and the intransigence of state and federal authorities. In hundreds of cities, towns, and municipalities, young women and young men conducted sit-ins, kneel-ins, teach-ins, wade-ins, and more in the face of what appeared to be intractable, inalterable, and impenetrable realities. Black women of every age who labored by day as laundry women, secretaries, seamstresses, cooks, caregivers, nurses, teachers, and more. They organized their local communities, conducted meetings, and led boycotts with scarce recognition. In time, young black people raised their fists and voices defiantly in the name of black power. The social myth of egalitarianism, deeply imprinted on the American national psyche, was everywhere powerfully being contradicted by Black America's carceral reality. African Americans rejected their former disenfranchisement and miseducation, refused to accept second-class status, and turned to the critical task of unmasking the American meta-narratives of democracy and exceptionalism. 1968 was a watershed year in the freedom struggle and in the history of the United States. A major Tet Offensive was launched by the North Vietnamese against South Vietnam and its allies, including the United States. Anti-colonialist resistance had taken hold across Africa. Feminist struggles and theories were emergent. Quadrennial campaigning for President of the United States was in full force. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense had become a leading force for libertarian change in urban settings. The Stonewall Uprising for LGBTQIA rights lay just over the horizon, and the Marion Wright Edelman-inspired Poor People's Campaign was preparing to launch a movement to fundamentally challenge the federal government and our society on the root causes of structural and systemic poverty. Persons who ascended to national public leadership during this period embraced with great reluctance, sometimes to their own peril, the fierce and unrelenting demands of the time. And then there was Memphis, Tennessee, the majestic dignity of black sanitation workers, organizing for just wages and humane working conditions, the near endless phalanx of black manhood signs, the martyrdom of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the urban unrest, insurgency and conflagration, and a reassessment of the nation's progress toward our common humanity. My classmates could not wait to tell our new homeroom teacher about my desktop antics. I will never forget the words I heard next. "Don't worry, I know his parents." I was mortified to find out that my new teacher also belonged to the same church as my family. In black churches, now and then, children were expected to get, quote, get the learning and the burning, to join head and heart, the life of the mind and the life of the spirit, in education and in faith. Expectations for young people ran high, and communal integrity, social identity, and personal dignity were regularly invoked as an article of faith. Mrs. Dobbins was a highly respected educator and student advocate in our church, in our small local black community. You're probably wondering, why do I keep calling Miss Lois Dobbins' name? Because she's an ancestor now, and she will never be forgotten by at least one person on the face of this planet, and I am confident by so many others. She saw resident in me one of her rare young black male charges, possibilities I had not yet begun to contemplate, through demanding assignments, before and after school detention, report cards, and disciplinary reports to my parents. She mentored me. Virtually against my will, she mentored. And with the local and focal requirement that I embrace my full capabilities. You see, Mrs. Lois Dobbins believed in me, and she demanded that I believe in myself. 54 years have passed since the martyrdom of Martin. Assessments of our national progress toward we the people and e pluribus unum remain frighteningly uncertain. For black communities, there has been no contemporary closure to our freedom movement, but ongoing continuities. In the words of the noted poet Herbert Woodward Martin, nothing has changed. We have slipped backward. A good deal has changed. We are moving forward. As a nation, our dedication to democratic virtues and to our wholeness as an entire people has in turns waxed and waned and deepened and diminished. Present-day challenges are deeply intersectional and arguably more complex than ever before. Hegemonic analysis and draconian practices have had a chilling effect on our freedoms, characterized by the efforts of some to turn back the hands of time. I think they call it restorationism, to return America to a pristine former ideal that never was in the first place. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it is a long walk to freedom. Today, we struggle against what the biblical record calls principalities and powers, a proliferation of environmental challenges to our health and well-being, white supremacy and toxic masculinity, gender injustice and inequality, hate crimes against LGBTQIA+, and particularly trans people, militarized law enforcement, food deserts, mass incarceration, human trafficking, social stigma, bullying, misogyny, and ecological abuse. We also advocate, we don't just struggle against, but we also advocate for anti-racism, women's reproductive freedoms, equitable health care, gender diverse representation, ethnic and religious pluralism, living wages, immigrant protections, disability rights, voting rights, care of the earth, a sustainable future, and so much more. Challenging, collective, demanding, and sacred work, our road to systemic change for the health of us all seems to have only just begun. After 400 years of sojourning in this land, our struggle continues. In the steadfast words of Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. In 2022, many young people, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Arabic, Asian, and not a few whites, find themselves on the opposite end of anything remotely resembling sustenance and support in this life. They live in a season where growing up is not counted in years, but in the thickness of the trauma they have endured. They have known a world made harsh and opaque by our constructed heterogeneities of geography, sexuality, race, and class, a catastrophe of pandemics, brutal policing, the hubris of hate. They do not always know they have access to liberative resources sufficient to help them awaken to their own magnificent power. They have had little lived experience or aspirational capital to envision a meaningful future in the face of clear and present dangers. In pluralistic America, young people under the age of 30 are customarily unchurched and claim no religious affiliation. Their generation is often described as spiritual but not religious. Countless youth and young adults and some of their elders would agree. There is no church in the wild. What is the wild? Jessica and I have a beautiful young daughter and son. And our son is not only an ordained minister, he is also a healthcare consultant. He is on staff at a Baptist UCC church. Some of you may know Covenant in Washington, D.C. Anybody know Covenant? That's where we were members before coming to Louisville. He is on staff there, and he powerfully describes the wild in one of his sermons, and I quote him: "The places where black and brown people of this world continue to try to make a life under varying states of poverty, famine, brutality, and an utter lack of respect for their place in the rainbow of humanity. These same people in America continue to face the beast that is systemic oppression with state-sanctioned police brutality at the tip of the spear. They are talking about the place where the words job and security have become foreign concepts to both the working population and those who are about to come of age, where even if one can navigate the terrain of questionable schools, challenging living conditions, and poor access to health care and make it through to get a college education, there is still no guarantee of a career to provide financial security for one's family. In addition to everything else, further oppressive hierarchies and value judgments are created based on gender and sexuality. People are tired of it all. Folks are angry and scared, ready to fight on all sides, and compassion for our fellow human beings is at a significant deficit. This is the context in which young people in the wild are trying to survive. Young people who find no home, no sense of belonging in much of the hypocrisy that too often passes for our institutional lives today. They are deeply enmeshed in a world of physical and social death and have little margin for error in this land. As elders, we have been loath to hold ourselves accountable, personally and professionally, and we have essentially let our generations behind us, we have terribly let them down. With every successive generation, it is young people who best remind us through the dynamism of their actions how transformational change draws on resources from the recent past and establishes its own distinctive way forward. Today, at the vital intersection of COVID and the criminalization of black and brown bodies, a new movement has been recognized. The momentum seized and a movement formed from below in the streets and homes all over the United States in the wild. Out of our endemic racism, the body politic has been challenged to become anti-racist as never before. Racial bias, also called unconscious bias and implicit bias and all manner of other biases, is a less overt and often unconscious form of racism, but it is no less lethal for its subtlety. Dressed in the guise of merit, normalcy, and custom, this form of racism works effortlessly at making injustice look just. White supremacy, the will to power and subordinate based on pathologies of race, is racism's more muscular form. It is the one that is most often referred to. It is most empirically evident, and yet mysteriously, nobody in our society seems to practice it. I've not been able to make the logic of how that works. Without provocation, Black lives are targeted and terminated with extreme prejudice. Every death and dehumanization marks a searing new inflection point in America's fraught racial history. Redlining, income inequality, institutionalized disproportionate arrest, mass incarceration against Black people, state and state-sanctioned violence and death. The list of injustice is never ending. We wait for the next hashtag. We say their names. We truth tell their lives. We tell the stories of the United States of America that America does not want to hear. Emmett, Henrietta Lacks, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade. The list goes on. The sheer volume of the killing of Black children, women, and men, straight, trans, and queer, across the generations defies every deceptive attempt to relegate these events to isolated individuals. Can I say critical race theory? Can I say 1619? Can I say anti-racism? Even if I can't say it, I will say it anyhow. Because truth crushed to earth, well, I'm not supposed to be preaching, will rise again. Here in Louisville, it is 2 years to the week that Breonna was killed in a no-knock raid. Justice has not come. Law enforcement has not been charged. Our freedom struggle continues. All evidence to the contrary, there is hope in the relentless nature of our ongoing protests. They are the dress rehearsals for a new humanity taking shape, new modes of community coming into being, new collective life ways emerging among today's disinherited that embraces all people, exhilarating, beautiful, exquisite Black, brown, and white people from every background, condition, and circumstance, for those who are courageous enough to embrace the vision. Today's movement is being led by young people, many of whom are queer and trans, and absolutely affirming of their own sense of faithfulness. It may not look like church, but it is very much church. They are doing church outside the walls of power, on the streets, and in social media. They recognize that all manner of intersectional oppression is alive and well and will not be eliminated without a sustained mass challenge. They need us old heads to join the fight. The movement is not only viral, racial, ethnic. It is not just the movement for Black lives. That fierce insistence that the liberation of Black folk is altogether bound up with human liberation, social transformation, and creation's freedom. Yes, it is all about that, but it is more still. The deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA. Those determined dreamers, mostly a movement of the undocumented, powerfully contending against state restrictions to affirm that America's greatest strength comes from its inclusivity and path to citizenship for immigrants rather than detention centers and deportation. It is the Tarana Burke Me Too movement, women and some men working in solidarity toward a world free of sexual violence, breaking the silence against rape, sexual harassment, and assault, and resolving to end the power of misogyny everywhere. It is the 2018 March for Our Lives. Students galvanizing for action in support of stricter gun laws. From Parkland, Columbine, and Sandy Hook to Orlando and Las Vegas. It is the movement across the globe of student climate strikes for change, embodied in Autumn Peltier, Anishinaabe, member of the Wickwimquong Nation of Canada, 13 years old at the time, powerfully challenging world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly. It is 15-year-old Swedish environmentalist Greta Thunberg, who similarly challenged the world to take a stand on climate. As I said this morning at our breakfast table, I am glad that we are still having the cold days of winter, because at the very least it means that we have not fallen off the climate cliff yet. I know we want to hurry up and get to warm weather, but let's keep the cycles as they ought to be. The challenge is Hands Up United. We Charge Genocide, Standing Rock, Dream Defenders, Color of Change, and so much more. It is the black, brown, and disaffected bodies of our youth of every description in localities and municipalities everywhere. The very nature of change is that it does not often materialize swiftly enough. Certainly not as fast as we want. Sometimes it doesn't even happen in our lifetime. To use the language of Antonio Gramsci, sometimes an optimism of the will is required. You have to believe in a long vision that will outlive you. Except the work is done, no one will ever witness it. 4 years into my time at Louisville Seminary, we stand in solidarity with the movement for Black lives, justice for Breonna Taylor, and so much more. But as we have protested, attended rallies, and spoken publicly, more importantly, I have had the opportunity to listen and learn much from young leaders who live with their backs against the walls, organizers who are utterly determined to be complicit in their own liberation, to live free from the confines of the urban police state and its suburban outposts. I am so very proud of our LPTS seminarians, many of them young, but not all, who for months filled the streets and the jails, committed to the creation of a better and more hopeful world. Now the question arises, what must we do? In the words of Coretta Scott King, not unlike those of Angela Davis after her. Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. That is not what we have taught young people or older ones for that matter. Struggle is for every generation. As a people in movement toward justice and reconciliation, we are challenged to invite a new generation of the young and of us all to discover our own vital connections of spirit, to move beyond convention and orthopraxis to radical practices of love and inclusion. This starts with believing in something so very simple as the infinite worth of every human being everywhere. Only then can we bear witness to the possibilities of the present age. In the spirit of beloved community, we can join our surpassing faith with others, partner in our resolve, overcome our own worst fears, advance the common cause, advocate for the poor and oppressed, agitate for peace, wage justice, build a common humanity under a friendly sky. We can become co-creators of a new day, engaging in the kind of transcendent hope and prophetic advocacy that saves people's lives and helps to make us whole. Elders and young people and everybody in between, gender non-conforming and gender specific, siblings, we can dismantle the intergenerational divide and live and grow together. Women will love themselves fiercely and in power. Men will embrace the struggle for the full humanity of men. Dismantling hierarchy, we will embrace our gender diverse representation and find that because of matters of the human heart, we can no longer countenance queer and trans stigma, violence, and hate. We will build networks and alliances across our respective vocations, purviews, and worlds, mobilizing against all manner of bigotry and discrimination. We will advocate for a more just and verdant world, a safe energy economy, one shared earth. We will embrace the universe displayed. We will model sanctuary, one with another, because the safest place that I long to be in this world is in another person's heart. When faith meets public health, we have reason to hope. And I want to simply say to you, all evidence to the contrary for so many. God is in the wild, and we must be there too. Thank you.
Q&A here, and I've asked for a microphone, so what an inspiring speech and so much needed for Louisville and our country and world. So thank you. I'm going to take questions now, and I'm going to walk around with this microphone, so raise your hand if you've got one. Great.
Oh, I'm so blessed. My name's Kim Casey. I'm from Chicago. In your story, you mentioned something about your childhood and your peers of your youth reflecting and projecting the hopes and fears of their parents. What would you say to adults now or educators now that are dealing with the same thing?
Kim Casey? So, in our house, for many years, this is a conversation that has taken place pretty much every day because Jessica is a high school counselor. And before that, she was a middle school counselor. And before that, she was a college counselor. So she's got to go on through the ranks. And in the midst of all of that, we had children of our own. And so we have had to contend, I guess I should stay around with this. I can take it off. We have had to contend with these very questions. One of the things that I think is so terribly difficult in our day and time is that because we have so atomized, and I use that word very advisedly, because we have so atomized the definition of family. We have made of it a weapon. We have nuclearized it rather than what was not so very long the case. And what we are seeing, I think, whenever there is a natural disaster or whenever there is a catastrophe of war, we see people putting aside those legislated definitions of what human family is. And we find our ways back to each other. In a day and a time today where so many children, so many young people do not have access to the kinds of resources that they so desperately and profoundly need, we are called to be the village. And not only in our personal lives, which is terribly important, but we are also called in our respective venues. All of you are working in some area of public health, making sure that we are not only working in depth in our respective arenas, but that we are also making the intersections. Because one of the things that I keep sharing with people that I think we've neglected in our discussions of intersectionality is that intersectionality is not just about personal identity. Intersectionality is also about making the connections that are vital across all of the parameters that would divide us. That form of intersectionality, making sure that our human services and care and are met in ways that ensure that no one falls between the cracks, is, I think, the indelible cord that has yet to be found in our midst. Churches historically provided at least a modicum of that. Now we have, of course, morphed that into all forms of care and industry. But even those are not enough if it simply becomes a pro forma approach to meeting the needs of the basic needs of our children, and forgetting to recognize that every child has the imprimatur of the divine inscribed upon their being. That's what Lois Dobbins saw in me, and I didn't even know it was there. And that's what we must do with each other. It never ceases to amaze me, not only when I think back to my own childhood, but to so many other children that I've encountered, worked with, experienced, have done tutoring in public schools and those kinds of things. How many of our own parents and guardians and elders today have no sense of wherewithal when it comes to being able to take care of the children, because the state apparatus has continually taken more and more of that away from us.
Thank you.
I could say a lot more about that, and Jessica could say even more.
Another question?
Good afternoon. First, just saying thank you so much for that blessing that you've given us in speaking with us today. My name is Jamar, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm curious, when you talk about intersectionality, can you also talk about public policy, physical space, and how that then also plays a part in racial health and public health and the disparities that we see? Because I know in Cleveland, we've got the poorest people living in the oldest houses that need the most work, that are covered in lead paint, still have lead pipes. The folks have no money to fix it. There's no programs to help them fix their houses. And so they continue to have all types of health problems that are caused by the physical space. And I'm wondering, can you talk about that, and then what the church can do to improve physical spaces within our communities that have been intentionally neglected and public policy has isolated, and so we continue to have terrible health outcomes, and it seems like no matter what we do, it doesn't get fixed.
Was it Jabari? Did I hear you right?
Jamar.
Jamar.
Yes.
Jamar. Thank you for your excellent question, Jamar. Public policy is I don't want to use this language. Let me say this, put it this way. Public policy is typically perceived to be the next step beyond movement policy. I don't agree with that notion. Movement and policy are to walk hand in hand with each other. They are to be in constant dynamic tension with each other. In the 1950s, there was that little landmark case called Brown versus Board of Education, right? People remember one justice who, of course, would go on and lead that process. We know that Thurgood Marshall was very much a systems person, very much committed to matters of policy. He also begrudgingly, and I say begrudgingly because if you go back and look at the history, it is the case. He also begrudgingly had to acknowledge that there would be no Brown if there was not the movement that was resurgent taking place across the United States of America. We have to have both. When it comes to issues of redlining, when it comes to issues of banks and mortgage lending, we saw what happened in 2007 and 2008, that the communities that were most oppressed, that were most destroyed, most fractured, were those communities that you just mentioned. And of course, you heard me also mention in terms of my own family. My folks came from Mississippi, and they weren't supposed to get that house. But they got it anyway, and that's a whole nother story. Most of the time, it doesn't work that way. The restrictive policies that have been put in place, if you ever have an opportunity to look at the work of Joshua Poe, P-O-E. Anybody know Joshua Poe? Well, where's Abby? Where'd she go? Okay, well, Abby probably knows. Anyone who's, there she is. Anyone here in Louisville should know the work of Joshua Poe, who has done a magnificent mapping project on Louisville that does what I think needs to happen in every city and municipality and rural district when it comes to these very issues that you're talking about, so that we have precise empirical information about where all of the targeted discriminations, disparities, and injustices take place. It is not enough to merely talk about it anecdotally. We must also have the social science evidence in order to be able to make the case in legislatures, in town halls, and in the hallways of government. Both have to happen simultaneously. The anti-racist work that is going on today really emphasizes the priority of doing this kind of policy implementation. I would simply want to remind us that having the policy without also having the gravitas to support it does not take us very far. It becomes, in the good biblical language, sounding brass and tinkling cymbal. We have to be sure that what we are putting in place that is policy is not simply establishing new forms built on outdated capitalist systems, built on new forms of rank hierarchy, based on new forms of discriminatory practices against people, because all too often that is what is happening. We are simply substituting one policy manifestation for another that continues to keep people in oppressed conditions in new ways. Old skins, new wine, or whatever that biblical text is. That's the kind of thing that we have to really be careful about. Tracking systems in public schools were the segregation of schools before that. And we still see now in education, as an example, with the gifted programs. And my God, since we moved here to Louisville, it seems like every other corner there's not a church, there's a Christian school. Those Christian schools don't exist for no reason. They exist because there are so many people of a particular derivation of the faith who have decided that they want to practice their faithfulness absent so much of rank humanity. And they will know we are Christians by our love. Christian schools everywhere. And when you walk into them, you can scarcely find faces of color, children of color, children who not meet the normative gaze. And this is just one example that we could go across our institutional economic profiles, our corporate structures, the halls of jurisprudence. We could do this in every sector of our society, including, I would certainly say, healthcare, which has really been derelict in duty across our nation. When I was at Emory, Jamar, we established a faith and health program at Emory. Now, let me just say this. When we added the patina of racism to the equation, our university was not terribly enthralled with wanting to see the project continue onward. We wanted to do it as as an institution, we wanted to do it in a way that would provide a vacuum, erase historical memory, relieve us of intergenerational responsibility. That is what got us in this mess in the first place. Policy must be not only forward-looking, it must also be absolutely committed to the demolition of those atrocities that took place in the past. If they are not doing both and, then they are, I feel, at a deficit. Again, that's a long answer, but there are so many other pieces that we could say about policy. I should mention I'm a sociologist in terms of background, so I'm very comfortable having these conversations about spirit and society all at the same time. It just works. It works for me. But if we do not have what Maya Angelou called the cardinal virtue of courage to do the right thing, then not much else matters. That's why I so much love the resolution that you all did last year. And I said, wow, the UCC, they got it right on paper. Other comments?
You got another question back here. Oh.
I'm sorry, where?
Hi, Dr. Pollard, thank you so much.
Alton, please. Yes, thank you.
I'm a fellow Washingtonian. I'm Sandy Sorensen. I work with the United Church of Christ, Washington, D.C. Public Policy Advocacy Office. And so many things that you said that did my heart good, especially the idea that movement and public policy have to go together, because so often we pit them against each other, or we pit direct service against public policy advocacy, and we need it all.
We need it all.
And too often, what I'm seeing, especially right now in Washington, is you win an election, you put people in, you think are going to do the right thing, they don't do the right thing, and we just fall back and sit on our hands. And I'm wondering, what can we do to change? How can we empower ourselves, inspire ourselves to change the narrative? We should be running to the polls in November, to say, we needed Build Back Better. We need these programs. Where were you? Where are you? And not let our legislators, our decision makers off the hook. And so I often have to challenge myself and my colleagues to say, but what are we doing? How are we trying to change the narrative? What would you say to that?
Tell me your name again, ma'am.
Sandy.
Sandy. I cannot help but think, Sandy, about Build Back Better and those efforts to thwart the set aside of the filibuster in order to get it done. With my apologies in advance to any of our West Virginia colleagues who are here, that the same barriers that have been put in place to ensure Build Back cannot happen were relinquished for even more monies to be sent for the militarization of our armed forces. It's amazing to me how we can make these easy discernments. It was okay to remove the filibuster so that we can make sure that we properly arm our service people. And of course, they should have all that is needed to ensure for the protection of the nation. But if having a better infrastructure is not also very much a protective measure, if it is not also very much a health measure, I'm not quite sure what is. And yet, we have seen this time and time again, And I am absolutely convinced that so many of us who, how to say this, thought Shangri-La had arrived in 2008, despaired in 2016, and now are at 6s and 7s. We're betwixt and between in 2022. I'm not a politician, but I can play one for a moment. And I will simply say this: the current president of the United States is sitting in the most unenviable of positions, not unlike what was taking place 50 plus years ago in our nation. And if you want to be in that kind of a hot seat, then you had better be ready to take on all that goes with it. Again, the word courage. But we are not, as citizens, supposed to leave leadership hanging there by themselves. We are supposed to take up the gauntlet, rise to the challenge, be the phenomenal nation that we claim to be. And that means participating, voting with our feet in grassroots advocacy, including ensuring that voting rights legislation is kept in place, kept intact, and we are not exactly doing that. And that's tragic. We're not doing it when it comes to challenging. We know that ERA is on the fence, to put it mildly. We know that women's reproductive freedoms are being wiped off the map. We know that trans and queer people are being systematically attacked. We know that profiling goes with the identity of being black and brown. We know that death is facing the livelihoods of all kinds of people in our society, and most of us prefer to simply go about our daily routines unchallenged. That's not the Nazarene that I know. It is not the faith that I have experienced. Let me tell you a little story I didn't tell you about growing up. As the only black family for miles around in St. Paul, in my high school years, I left school at a different time every day. The principal of our school gave me that permission because I would never have gotten home alive otherwise. I learned every back alley, every back way to try and ensure that I would get home in one piece. Because to be black in that white community in Minnesota nice, St. Paul, was horrific. And to this day, I still wrestle with the trauma of that. And I can only imagine the trauma that we are perpetuating against legions and legions and legions and legions of our young people, and by extension, all of us, now, well into the 21st century. My parents didn't even know that I had gotten this permission until I was in my 40s. I never told them. But it was the way that I was able to navigate. And the only safe harbor that I had was the church. And I could go to the church, our church, where Lois Dobbins was. And I knew that in that place there was sanctum sanctorum, holy of holies. That in that place there was salvus, salvation, which in its original derivation means, I heard somebody say it, health. There was healing for me. And this is what we need our communities to continue to do and be for each other. Places of health and healing. Sanctuary, not just safe space. Bold space. Outrageous space. And then our children and our children's children will say, wow, there's something about this thing called faith that in the way that you all practice it, you old heads. And maybe we can get with that. In walking in the streets and being in protests, you hear very clearly, young people are not at all disinterested in religion. They just don't like the way we be practicing it. Okay? So just want to make that clear.
Thank you. I think
Thank
we
you,
have
Sam.
one more question here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Peggy Mullen. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, that bastion of progressiveness. Yes. I think my question is a little bit related to Sandy's. Arizona turned blue in the last election, which was incredibly inspiring to those of us that live there. And yet at the state level, we this year see 37 bills introduced related to restricting voting privileges. Our state house just passed the heartbeat bill, and I could go on and on and on. I think my concern is related to Sandy's. We put people in office, and yet there are forces outside the political system integrated. And I'm thinking specifically of gerrymandering and dark money. And we're at a loss. Many of my close friends are involved politically, and we just cannot seem to crack those nuts. Any thoughts on that?
Peggy, right? Yes. Peggy, you can crack some nuts now. I'm not, okay, I'm not too concerned about that. Or heads. What season is this liturgically? What does Lent represent? Reflection, repentance. Is taking us into, before we get to Easter, crucifixion. Who told you that this was supposed to be easy? Who told us that we were going to have our way just because we were doing the right thing? That's why I said earlier, we may live the entirety of our lives struggling for justice and finding out at the end of our days that it may still not have come. Why is it that within the span of our lifetimes, we believe that everything should be settled? This is why I quoted Angela Davis. This is why I quoted Coretta Scott King. This is a matter of life and death that will go on until we have no breath left in our bodies. And when we have no breath left in our bodies, it will continue on with others. When the Berlin Wall fell, there were so many people who could not believe it. It had been there for so long, folk were pretty much at the point of saying, there's no way that we can bring down this edifice. And then we looked up and we saw Tiananmen Square happening, and we saw one thing after another happening. A few years later, apartheid begins to fall. And it had been there for so long that people had come to the point of believing that it was not possible that we could remove this behemoth. It took longer than a lifetime, lifetimes. We have seen the movement of a body politic in the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. I'll stop there. That so energized a world to believe in the possibility of democratic freedoms that we scared ourselves to death and went back to doing things the same old way with a vengeance. And we went through 4 years of that hellacious experience. And if our objective is to overcome, remember, in this season, the overcoming is not left to us, Peggy. The overcoming is left to the one who was on a cross with a thief on one side and a person of good repute on the other. And our job is to ensure that the children of God everywhere have access to the God within themselves for whatever form of healing and wholeness and well-being they need. And in the process of that fermentation, we will begin to see even more the healing of a nation that does not yet know itself. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Sing together, children, don't you get weary. Pray together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. We're not there. We're not close. We are further than we've ever been. Teeming humanity is waiting for us to continue to be courageous. And then there are those who would hope that we would wither and die. And we must never allow fear to have the last word. That's the message of Easter. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Pollard, Alton, for everything that you've given to us this morning. You've given us so much to think about. So we thank you for being with us. We're moving now into a time of reflection, and there are some suggested reflection questions on the app and up on the screen now. And I invite you to take some time around tables before the break at 10:45 to reflect on these or whatever's on your heart and mind. From there, we will go into workshops at 11 after a stretch break at 10:45. There's 3. More Money for Ministry in Broadway A, Leading with Love Through Crisis in Broadway B, featuring UCAN staff, and Tackling Tough Conversations with Nicole Havelka in Broadway C. So I invite you to take some time around the table to reflect. You all have asked for time to interact with each other and connect and dig into the theme. And Alton has certainly given us a lot to dig into. Thank you.